Well, it's the morning after the night before. Ashes of Creation just had a huge dev stream, and there are a lot of people who aren't happy and some people who are very happy. What has caused this division in the community? We will also talk about what is actually in the alpha phases, in alpha 2, phase 1, 2 and 3. But let's get on to the divisive issues of the day. I think for a lot of people, the first issue was simply that they announced there were going to be different phases, and in those phases, the first phase is not an always on 24/7 persistent alpha. That caused a lot of surprise in the community for most people. Now, actually, some people saw that coming, and you guys are maybe like true 5-heads. So what they're doing in October, on the 25th, I think, they're going to start weekend testing. So the game will be live probably like Friday until Sunday night, and then it will close for a week, well, 5 days, and then it will go live again the following Friday to Sunday. That pattern will persist up until phase 2, and phase 2 will begin on December 20th. Phase 2 isn't quite persistent, but is getting there. And phase 3 basically is persistent. We don't fully know how phase 2 will work. Now, phase 1 and 2 are expected to have a lot of bugs. Keep in mind that this obviously is an alpha. It will be a proper work in progress alpha. They want everybody to emphasize that. So I'll do my due diligence and say that. Now, technically, in the end of July live stream, Steven said something about ramping up playtime. So he sort of mentioned it, and I guess can point to that as being the indication of when it was, you know, stated. But my interpretation of that comment was that he was ramping up playtime from the Alpha 1 testers doing the NDA testing. I didn't see coming the fact that the October testing wouldn't be 24/7. I thought that's when we were getting the persistent test. As did, I think, most people. But you know, if you're smarty pants, fine, okay. So that caused a bit of shock. I don't necessarily know if people are really that angry about that. For me, it was surprising and a little bit disappointing, but I can understand it, even if it's not what I wanted. Ultimately, I think it might end up being a good idea. The weekend of the first weekend and the second weekend and even maybe the third weekend, I think will be like proper chocolate. But then I think things will simmer down, and it's almost a way to ease into it. The queues on day 1 are going to be insane though, for sure. So not persistent straight away. I don't think that's a major issue. Obviously, it's a little bit disappointing. Let me know if you're angry about that though. I don't think most of us are. And the next one that has caused a little bit of anger, I think, is the pricing of these Alpha 2 keys. They are specifically only Alpha 2 keys, by the way. You're not getting beta, you're not getting any gubbins. It's just access to the alpha. And this is obviously an issue where if they priced it too expensively, nobody would buy in. And if you price it too cheaply, the people like myself who's paid $250, or some people have paid more than that, but I haven't, they might feel a little bit short-changed. So this was always going to be difficult. But what they're doing is if you want to get in phase 1 of the Alpha 2, it's going to be $120. Phase 2 is $110 and phase 3 is $100. Now that is quite high. Let's just call a spade a spade. It's quite a lot just for an Alpha 2. It is worth knowing that if you buy the phase 1 access, you do get access to phase 2 and 3. If you buy phase 2, you get access to phase 2 and 3. And if you buy phase 3, you get, well, just phase 3. Personally, I don't like this separation in pricing a little bit. And the reason is, if you're going to spend $100, it's quite easy to be like, well, I'll just spend $110. Oh, well, if I'm going to spend $110, I'll just spend $120. I feel like that pricing there is very, it's almost incentivizing to buy phase 1, but they're literally then also saying, do not buy phase 1 because that's when there will be a lot of bugs. One little caveat to all of this as well is that actually phase 1, you can buy it starting on August 21st, but you don't get into the first 2 weekends. That's exclusive for somebody who has a previous package. They're also doing a little bit of FOMO with that. Now, it's not really the end of the world because you can sort of see what YouTubers and Twitch streamers are playing, but they're doing this thing, for example, where the sales will end a week before you actually have access. I think that's literally just to create a little bit of pressure in buying it, and I don't like it. I wish they would make it so that's not the case. Maybe it's so they need to know the numbers. I can understand it practically, but I still don't like it. Okay, simple as that. Overall, I think the major issue is just the pricing balance. It was always going to be difficult. I agree with opening up the keys again. I think that makes perfect sense. But as I said, if you priced it too low, people who've already bought in would be a little bit angry. And if you price it too high, which if I'm honest, I think this is just a little bit too high, then you get people calling it like a scam and being like, I'm not going to play this. It's very strange in a way to be buying just into the alpha test without them buying into subsequent betas and stuff like that. The game itself doesn't have a box price, so it's not really the end of the world, but it just feels a little bit weird. I would have done one of two things. I would have included the beta access. I don't think people would have been that angry. I can only speak for myself, obviously, but I wouldn't really be that bothered if people were paying $120 to not get all of the sub fees and stuff like that, but still get access to the betas. And I think that would have felt a little bit better. I would also not personally have been that angry if they reduced it by $20. Maybe even keep the 121 and then go 100 and then $80. Something like that would have also been fine. The big accusation here is that they're trying to milk. What's funny is that Stephen basically said, hey, we need testers. And whilst they didn't necessarily directly say that they need money, they did speak about how the project has so far cost around about $90 million and how the sales of the game have basically made around about $30 million. So at the moment they have a $60 million deficit. Selling keys is obviously a way of easing that deficit somewhat. Maybe not by that much, but by a little bit. But my point is, they need testers. They also might need money, which I guess is the reason you've come to these prices. It makes sense. I'm not angry about it. I don't think people should be that angry about it. You don't have to buy it. One thing that does sort of stress me a little bit is I feel like any criticism about anything in the Ashes of Creation community is often just hand waved away by saying it's just an alpha. Well, we're not necessarily criticizing the gameplay or how technically broken it is or it isn't. We're criticizing monetization, and I think that's still reasonable. A lot of people will be like, hey, you're not buying a game, you're funding a project. Well, a lot of people, they're looking at the value for themselves. They want to play it. It's that simple, right? You might not agree with it, but they do. Overall, it's not like an issue, I think, to be like losing heads over. Like, you know, it's not that big of an issue. I think it's a little bit too expensive, or they could have added beta. That would have been a nice little touch. Difficult balance though, let's appreciate that. And then for the actual testing, one thing that people kicked off a little bit over, which I don't think is that big of an issue, I think probably just a little bit of a misunderstanding, is they said they were going to have 3 NA servers and 3 European servers. And people calculated, considering there was going to be 3,000 concurrent users per server, that's only 18,000 people, and yet over 100,000 have Alpha 2 access already. Now those numbers might sound like completely off base, but actually there's sort of like a calculation that you take your concurrent users and you times them maybe by around about 10 or 20, and that's how many max or like actual users you have in a day. So you might have 20,000 concurrent, but you probably have 200,000 people playing your game as people log in and log off and stuff like that. Now that's obviously just an estimate, but 18,000 would be 180,000 people. However, that's obviously not how a test like this is going to work. They're going to be very front heavy. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will play these for the first couple of weekends in each phase and then probably just stop. Intrepid did say though that they can ramp up the servers, and I think they will have to ramp them up for the first weekend. I think, you know, 6 servers in total is going to be way too few. But overall, like, there's going to be massive queues when you get into it, right? It's just going to happen. And then actually, let's move on to the content in phase 1, 2, and 3. It's worth noting that the plan is to have all of the content that is listed in the current phase by the start of the next one. So phase 1 will be up until December 20th. And phase 2 is up until May 1st. And then they'll have that content in it. And phase 3, they just said, will be in a couple of months after phase 3, because eventually phase 3 will be everything, right? You know, we'll have almost all of the game. And there were a couple of surprises here. The first one is that the phase 1 is going to have 3 zones. Now, technically, it's probably more like 1 full zone and then a half of a zone and then half of a zone. And that's because those 2 zones, which are going to be the Sand Squall Desert and the Vadagar Tropics, are going to be expanded upon in phase 2. You will get 5 nodes in phase 1, but they're only going to go to level 3. There will be a lot of systems that are included, like the node currency, the node citizenship, the node building, mayoral stuff. Yeah, a lot of exciting stuff there. One disappointing thing is that there will only be 3 races. We sort of expected more of them because we'd seen them, but they spoke about how they needed to do the deforming so that, you know, the armor would actually fit on a dwarf and stuff like that. The 3 races that they're having at the start are going to be the Vec, the Kayla, and the Empyrean. The weapon list, I think, is pretty much what they listed, so nothing crazy there. For the PvP, it will have the corruption system, the node war system, the caravan system, and then very interestingly, the Guild War system, which we don't really know too much about, as well as a new thing called a Lawless Zone. Now, the Lawless Zone, I didn't really like the way Steven spoke about it, but it's basically taking it from the high seas and putting it on land. The idea being anybody who goes there will suddenly become automatically flagged as a combatant. You can be killed anywhere at any time in the game, but you get corruption. Here, you won't get corruption if you kill somebody, basically. And in this zone is where most of the PvP will probably start on a day-to-day basis, because there's going to be high value resources that you can pick up and you can drop, but that will then help you with crafting, making gold, what have you. Now, I hope it's not like the whole game. I hope this isn't the main way of progression. I hope there's other variations and other paths to take, but it sounds interesting as long as it's not sort of like overdone. Let's be honest, it's going to be an absolute Zerg fest with who can take the biggest guild in there. We also know that they're going to be starting with 6 archetypes. It's going to be all of them except the rogue and the summoner. They will have some other systems, like they're going to have mounts, at least flying mounts and ground mounts. Water mounts were a little bit dubious because they have it in phase 3 as well as phase 1. There will be caravans, rafts, and actually a lot of the professions as well. The max level for the profession will be 25 and the max level for your character will also be 25. I thought we'd heard 30 at one point, but obviously they've changed that. Eventually, I think that will all increase in the alpha, but that'll be beyond phase 3. For the content though, you will get the Node War God Spike, so Node Wars should be happening at least. And then obviously there's going to be world bosses. The actual Grand Dungeon Tower of Carfin will be there. And yeah, pretty exciting. Phase 2 expands upon the 2 zones that we mentioned, the desert and the tropics. Also adds 2 new node layouts. Now, I'm not sure if it adds any more nodes. It's not quite obviously stated, so I'm not going to comment on that. They will obviously expand upon the node system here. They're going to do freehold, for example, in phase 2. And they're going to add 2 more races, the Veilun and the Dunir. For the archetypes, the rogue is coming in phase 2. There'll be a couple of extra weapons. There'll be dual daggers, scepters, 2-handed maces and 2-handed axes in phase 2 as well as some new systems, as well as the honing, which I think is basically tempering and gear ascension, but you'll also get gems and sockets at this point. You'll also get leaderboards in phase 2, which will be very exciting as well as player shops. Because the game is going to have an economy, but I don't think the economy features are really added until later. We also won't be getting the story arcs for the Riverlands until phase 2. No news on when we get the story arcs on the others, as far as I know. In phase 3, we get the Turquoise Sea and the Anvils, as well as 4 unique node layouts. Again, no news on if we get new nodes at that point, but I would assume so. And the node levels also go to level 5 here. For the races, we will then get added the Pyre, the Renkai, the Nakua, and the Tulnar, and that'll be all the races complete. For the archetypes, here we will get the Summoner, which will finish off all of the basic archetypes, and then they'll start working on the secondary archetypes, starting with the Cleric and the Tank. Now, I don't know if that means everybody can then become a secondary Cleric or Tank, or if only Clerics and Tanks can take secondary archetypes. I'm not really sure how that will work. They'll finish off the weapons with the Orb and the One-Handed Axe, and the One-Handed Sword Pierce, which I'm not 100% sure what that is. Is it like a rapier, maybe? For the systems, they'll eventually add the guild functionality into phase 3. There will be castle sieges as well as naval gameplay, which is basically sailing. There will be underwater combat at this point, as well as instance content, which we don't really know what they mean here. Do they mean dungeons? Do they mean battlegrounds? You'll get transmog and the dying gear system, aerial combat from the flying mounts, religion, which will be pretty important, and the auction house. Overall, I don't really have a problem with the content that is in alpha. I think that makes perfect sense. I don't even mind the delivery speed. They said they're going to do patches like pretty frequently, I think on a 6-week cycle, where they'll be doing like immediate bug fixes and then testing stuff and all that kind of stuff. That all sounds fine. I think really the community is just a little bit torn on the pricing of Alpha 2 key only access, as well as it maybe not being a persistent test, which most of us thought was going to be the case. People are angry. I don't necessarily know if we need the anger. I don't know if we're doing too much there, but I think it's reasonable for some people to be disappointed. They wanted to buy in, and at $120 or even $100, it's just a lot of money for some people. And then I'm also not overly in favor of any criticism of pricing just being hand waved away, being like, yeah, but you're funding a game. Let's be honest, people aren't funding the game out of the goodness of their heart for everybody. I know it's an alpha test, but people want to get the enjoyment from it, and there's no point pretending that's not the case. I mean, Intrepid even mentioned that there's a huge hunger for a high quality MMO experience. Do you know what they're doing with that hunger? They're basically going to milk, right? They're milking for $100+. Some people are upset. I'm not really that bothered. It doesn't really affect me necessarily. The only thing that really affects me is the, the weekend testing. And I don't hate it. I was just a bit surprised. I'm sure you will. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have a beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.